Okay. Let me share my screen. Put up my chat. And let me minimize right here. Okay. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, Professor.
Yes. Okay, let's see. Let's see where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So for quiz 6, looks like I mean 5 or 6, I forget. It's we had a mistake while we were transferring quizzes from Blackboard to Canvas, and apparently we used the wrong quizzes to when we moved them over, and what was supposed to be the database quiz turned out to be questions from an old Angular quiz. So don't worry about the quiz that is currently available. I'm going to reformat it and publish it later this week, possibly on Friday, so that you can take it over the weekend. All right. So yeah, don't worry about the Angular quiz that is there. Just please ignore it, and then I'll publish the correct one later this weekend. Okay. Sorry about that. So let's see. So we're still working on the JPA database assignment, and we've given you a couple more days to finish that up. Nevertheless, we're going to keep discussing some more material, which is we just started talking about being able to implement a RESTful web service, but using Node.js, which is somewhat the same that we did when we discussed Java RESTful APIs, but we're learning how to do it with JavaScript, since JavaScript is kind of taking over the world, with the front end, now Node.js in the middle tier, and we'll talk about it next week as also in the relational data, in the non-relational space. JSON has as a JavaScript object notation. JavaScript also has a big footprint, so we'll discuss that more next week. So meanwhile, we'll continue discussing the Node.js as an alternative middle tier solution, and using the assignments, the A7 assignment as a driver towards that goal. Before we continue, though, I did want to discuss briefly the A6 assignment, the database assignment. Right now, you're using a local database pointing to your MySQL database that is running on your machine. So it won't work if you deploy A6 to the Heroku server, since it's not going to be able to access your local database. Okay, it's going to look for it in the remote machine. It won't find it, and it will crash. I don't believe it'll even deploy. So for this assignment, the A6 assignment, you're not required to deploy it to Heroku. Just push everything you have in Git, and then share those repositories with the TAs. They will clone down your project and evaluate it locally on their machines. They'll set up the correct database and credentials, and then run your application locally on their machines. Okay, so yeah, don't worry about deploying this to Heroku. I did want to discuss remote databases, since we do want this to run on your remote Heroku machine. So I did want to discuss how you would go about doing that. The intention is for you to, by first week in April by the end of by when you submit A7, you will have deployed A6 to Heroku, and for it to be running remotely, entirely remotely in Heroku using a remote database. So I did want to discuss configuring the Heroku database. Okay. So let me first open up the project, the Java project. Let's see if they open. And let's see, section 2. And this is the Java project. Let's open that up. If you don't trust the source, what? Trust and open, maybe, yeah, of course. Yeah, so currently you are configuring your database right here, right? In main resources and in your applications, you are pointing to the database right here. And notice that it's pointing to your local server, local database. And locally, you might have different usernames and passwords for your own database, and you have a schema that you've created. So we want to replace this so that instead of this pointing to your local machine, it points to a database that we're going to configure in Heroku. It's going to have some IP address or some name, really, really long name, wherever this is actually running remotely. Some maybe somewhere halfway across the world, and maybe somewhere in Eastern Europe. We don't know, but it'll be some remote machine. And so I'd like to discuss how you go about doing that. So let me show you. If you go to Heroku, so this is the dashboard. And if you here, I'm going to share just here's a Java server. Here's a Java server that has already been deployed. And if you want to add a database, basically what you do is you go to resources, right here, resources, and look up a database that you want to use, right? So for instance, you might look for MySQL. And so here are a couple of options of various vendors that you would that you could use. Okay, there's JawsDB. I'm using this one, JawsDB, and it's free. How do I go away? Skip. And it's free if you keep it within a within a few different a few number of kilobytes or megabytes, and only if you go beyond, then you have to start paying. But once you add it, right, it will create for you this link over here, and when you click on it, it goes to the actual database where it's being hosted. And this right here, see this right here, that is the connection string. See that it says connection string. So this would replace this right here, right there, this whole thing. Okay, so you copy that, you paste it in here, right? But let's take a look at it real quick. What it means, right? So if you break it down, okay, the first part is your username and password, right? So this username :password, then it says @ then followed by the host. So this is the actual machine running on Amazon cloud service, AWS, listening at port 3306, right? Which is your equivalent is this localhost. So this whole localhost 3306 is it's this right here, theirs. Okay, so you would replace one with the other. And then the last part over here is this over here is the name of the database, which locally in your machine, you were able to give it a name. But remotely, right, when you're using a hosted environment, these databases are created on the fly for hundreds, thousands of users. So they come up with some generic, a unique name for the database, and you can't change it. That is the name of the database. That's it. You have to leave it alone. Okay. So, and really that's it. But you would also go and see these. Here are your usernames and passwords. Again, these are randomly generated. You can't change them. And that's what you would put here for your username and password, so that your database can log in to your database. Okay. So once you have that, right, and you can just deploy your Java server to Heroku. Okay. You can also copy this and bring up Workbench. And connect to that database. You can say, I want to create a new connection, and this is my Heroku connection 1, 2, 3. And you can copy this, right, the connection string, and you can paste it right here. Actually, not. No, you'll need the host. Here's the host name. Copy the host name, and there it is. You paste the host name right there, and then you copy the username. Username right here. Paste the name. Copy the password, and you can say the password. Say okay, and then you can test the connection. See that you're connected, and you can actually look at the remote database. Right? You can say click on that, and you should be able to see. There it is. See that, the name of the database, and you can see any tables that you might have created would be there. The table you're looking for is the widgets table, right? Which will appear here when you deploy your Heroku Java application. It will create the widgets table for you, just like it did when it created it locally on your database. It'll create it remotely in this database. Okay, and you can take a look at the database and see the content and whatnot. Okay. All right, did that make sense? That is how you set up a remote database.
So does that mean on assignment 6 we need to do like this and deploy a remote Heroku and
it's not required for assignment 6. So okay. Assignment 6 can just use your local database. I'm going to give everybody another week and a half or so. By assignment 7, right, you should have all this deployed on Heroku. But okay, for assignment 6, it's not required. It's okay if it's running on your local database. All right. That makes sense? All right. Okay. Yeah. So let's move on. Any other questions? Okay. Let's see. All right. All right. Let's see. So last time we met, we had started talking about Node.js and discussing how to create RESTful web services. And we had implemented the quizzes service, whose responsibility was to manipulate the data model that represented quizzes, right? And we were storing our data in files, right? Hard-coded files. Now this is going to change next week when we introduce non-relational database Mongo, where instead of using this file, we're going to be storing our data and all our quizzes in MongoDB. And we're going to be able to create, remove, update, and retrieve quizzes from the database, right? And so that's going to be next week. For now, we are going to be representing the data and JSON files, right? So let's look at the way we implemented it. The entry point to the application was this server.js, okay? And oh, this is section 1. No, this is section 1. Let me close this. And oops. And let's okay, that's Java section 1, 2. Okay, let me open the Node.js that we worked on together last week, last time we met. So let's say open section 2 server node. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so the entry point to our application is right here, right? It's the server.js. And so we discussed the fact that we were going to use the Express library, and we only discussed just a few couple things. I really I want to encourage you to on your own, right, go to the Express.js website, right, and explore their API reference. Right? So you go to the API reference and go to their current version 4.x, right? There's tons of really great stuff here. I encourage you to read through it and just become familiar with what's there. So definitely, you know, you're not going to be responsible for more than what we're doing here in class, right? I mean, but there's tons of other stuff here that we're not going to cover in class. So definitely, you know, just familiarize yourself with it. So I'm going to put here, you know, to do visit the actual website. Okay. Yeah. So we loaded it, and we created an instance. We configured a course, right, and then implemented several controllers. Right. One of them was to just illustrate how to use controllers, and the other one is an actual controller whose responsibility is to expose a data model through an HTTP API. Right. So let's take a look at the controller. So let's review what a controller is. Right. Controller, whether it's implemented with Java, C#, Node.js, Python, whatever language, right? It's a concept, right? It's an architectural concept that transcends, you know, languages or whatever libraries or infrastructure that you're using. And the idea, the architectural idea, is that controllers are responsible for handling HTTP, right? So controllers deal with all things HTTP. Okay, and so they are aware of paths, right? They're aware of HTTP gets, puts, posts, deletes, right? They are aware that they are participating in a client server architecture, right? So, you know, request response allows participating in client server architecture, right? Right, where the client sends a request and the server responds, right, and fulfills the response. So the controller is sits between two worlds, right? The HTTP world and the object world. JavaScript object world, right? and world. So it's responsible for converting an HTTP representation of the world, which is a world of streams, a world of binary data that is being transferred between processes, right? That is being serialized. Okay, so that world that has headers, it has bodies, it has cookies, it has IP addresses and paths. Okay, that world, and then it converts it into a JavaScript representation of requests, responses, and these maps that are made available through these objects, request and response. So everything that comes from the client is represented inside of the request, and that's how we get parameters, we get queries, we can interact with the path, we can read the body content coming from which we haven't done yet. All right, we'll do that next week. And it also allows us to send back data in the body. So yeah, so that's the whole responsibility of the controller, dealing with this interaction between these two worlds, right? It sits in the interface. It's the interface between the HTTP world and the object world. Okay, it is not responsible, for instance, for dealing with data, right? Instead, the services have that role. It is the services who actually know where to get the data, right? So the controller, because it's not its job to deal with the data, it delegates all data manipulation to the service. The service responsibility is to deal with data, getting the data, creating the data, updating the data, deleting the data. Okay, so in that sense, we're using a strategy or a how do you say strategy that is referred to as the division of concerns, right? Making sure that each module is responsible with, is concerned only with one task. Okay, so the controllers only deal with HTTP. Now the services also, right, are also well self-contained and are only responsible for dealing with the data. They don't care that they have no idea, or they should not care who's using the data, how they're using the data. Doesn't matter, right? For instance, here in the service, nowhere do you see anything that has to do whatsoever with HTTP or the front end. Okay, it is not the concern of the service to know these things. It only knows that the data is in this file, and it can return data for that file, or by an ID, it could eventually create data, update data, delete data. Okay, and makes available all these things in this API so that others in the application can use that data, regardless on how the data is being used. In our particular case, the data is being used through an HTTP API, right? But the service is agnostic to this, right? It could have been that it could be some other, maybe a command line application is using this service, right? Or a desktop application or a mobile application could all use the same service, right, to interact with the data. That makes sense? Next week, we're going to replace this. Instead of being a hard-coded file, right? Instead, we're going to create another module that is going to be called a data access object, right? Where it's going to encapsulate everything that has to do with interacting with the database, right? Just like the controller is the interface between HTTP world and the JavaScript world, the data access object is going to be the interface between the database, in our case will be Mongo, right? The interface between Mongo and the JavaScript world, right? So two adapters, right, that are interacting on behalf of everybody inside this JavaScript world. Make sense? That's next week. We'll talk about that next week. All right, so we have this, and I guess that was it, right? let me run this, and we were able to retrieve a list of, presumably, that we would be able to retrieve quizzes. Let's see if that's true. Apparently not. And what are we running? Server, and the server is here. And here we have the quizzes controller. Oh, it's listening at port 4000. Okay, listen to port 4000. And that's because we want to start interacting. Right, here it is, right? It works, right? We want to be able to start using the React application, right? So that it will integrate with the server, right? Through this API, okay? But we'll do that a little later. Let's review and create another controller so that we get a chance to practice it again, okay? According to the assignment, right, we're supposed to create another controller that allows us to deal with questions. Right? These are questions for the quizzes, right? And so basically, we want to make this data, right, of all these questions available on the web. Okay, and I believe we had started on that. We go to services. Yeah, we had created these questions, right? We had said that these questions belonged to certain quizzes, right? We said that, this question right here belonged to question 234, and this one also belonged to 234. So there were 3 questions that belonged to 234. There were 2 questions that belonged to 345, right? And 1 question that belonged to question 123, quiz 123. So we want to create the relationship between these 2, and expose this one-to-many relationship, right? With that one quiz is made up of many questions. Okay. So let's practice that, right? So we can recap what we did on Monday, right? And just practice a little bit more. So first of all, let's refactor this, and let's put these services, because since we're going to have at least 2 services, right? The quizzes services and the question service. Let's create directories for them, because apparently we need at least 2 files for each, right? The JSON file and the JavaScript file. So let's put them in a different directory. So let's put the quizzes, the data, right? And the data and the service inside of that directory. And let's create another directory that has everything to do with the questions. And we'll move that in there. Okay. I'm going to restart the server, making sure that I didn't break anything. See, let's restart. And if I retrieve it, let's see. Okay, there we go. So it's still working. All right. So let's do the same thing we did for quizzes. Let's do it for questions now, right? So the first thing is that we want to be able to manipulate this data structure. Now, right now it's a file, but next week it'll be a database. Okay. So the first thing is that we create a service. So let's create a service here. So it'll be the questions service, and so this would implement all the various operations of manipulating that data model, right? This data set, and so we in this particular case we are storing the questions inside a file. But next week, this will be a database instead. All right, we'll replace this implementation with a database, a Mongo database. Once you have the data, right, you would provide all sorts of operations that would deal with the data. You would provide all the functions that would allow you to create new instances, right? Create a question, right? You would want to be able to retrieve all the questions. Okay. You would want to retrieve a particular question if you know their ID. So all these are pretty standard functions that you would use to interact with any data model, right? Yeah, the CRUD command, the CRUD operations, right? Create, read, update, right? And also the delete, right? So delete question. Okay, and then you would make this available to everybody else by exporting it to the rest of the world. Find question by ID, and then update and delete. Okay. All right. Now, if you think about it, this is like the minimum operations that you would consider. There might be many more operations. Okay. In particular, the ones that would need to deal with the fact that typically questions are not considered to be standalone, right? That usually questions are part of some larger data structure, like a quiz, right? A quiz contains questions. Although perhaps maybe that's not true. I guess, you know, if you're creating a pool of questions, you could think that a question can exist on its own without existing as part of a quiz. So perhaps it might make sense that this operations, you know, might make sense to create a question, right, on its own. But now what we're interested in, though, we're interested in quizzes, right? And then having a quiz being an aggregation or composition of multiple questions, right? So probably another create function that we might want to use or create would be to create question for a quiz, right? And then you would provide, maybe you would provide the ID of the quiz, right? And then you would create the question inside of a quiz. Another one might be that so this one, find all questions. Would it make sense to retrieve the entire list of questions? Probably not, right? I mean, it could be hundreds, thousands of questions. And you know, I mean, what are you going to do with all the questions? Ideally, probably what you might want to do is you want to look at the questions as part of maybe either a quiz, right? And then you could have maybe 10, 20, 30 questions for a quiz, as opposed to, you know, all 1,000 questions, regardless of what quiz they're in, right? That would be kind of useless. So in our case, we would want to also implement things such as, you know, find questions for quiz, right? So given a quiz, given a particular quiz ID, you know, retrieve those particular questions in that quiz. Make sense? Anyway, I mean, there's plenty of stuff, plenty of things that can be done here. Let's focus just on a few of these. So I mean, there's some of them are trivial, right? Like find all questions. Well, that's trivial. You just do, you know, return questions. That's it, right? That's the implementation. That's pretty stupid, right? What about this one? Find questions for quiz. Find questions for quiz. So that would mean, how would that work, right? Presumably you're going to provide us with a quiz ID, right? And then we would kind of out of this whole array, we would have to iterate over the array, looking for the questions that have that quiz ID, right? And if we find it, we keep those. All the other ones we don't keep. So that sounds much like a filter, right? So we're going to return the questions filter. We're going to filter the this array of questions with the following filter. We're going to say the question. We are going to only keep the ones where the question, the quiz ID, if the quiz ID matches the quiz ID that you're giving us as a parameter, we want to keep that one, right? So we want to filter and only retrieve those. Okay. How about this one? Find question by ID. That's easy too, right? So if you give me the question ID, right, then I need to go through the array of quizzes of questions and compare them to the ID of the question, and only keep the one that matches, right? All the other ones I don't want. So that sounds much like a find, right? And we saw that JavaScript has a find method. So it works this way. You say questions, then you do a find, and then you tell it what the criteria of how to search for this, right? So it's iterating. It's going to give us each question at a time, and the one we're going to return the question when the question ID matches the QID that you pass us as an argument. That's the question we want. Anyway, these are just a few, right? You're probably only going to need these. I don't know that you're going to need the other ones. Maybe next week you'll need probably the other ones. Okay, let's see. So now we want to be able to expose this data model, even though it's not complete, right? But I think we have enough. We want to expose it to the rest of the world through a web API. I have not started my video. We want to expose this through a web API, which is implemented through the use of a controller, right? So let's take a look at that. Right. So if we want a controller, there'll be a controller for the questions, right? And that would be questions controller. And so in here, what we want to do is for each one of these, we want to expose them and make them available through an API. So create a question. Well, that would be what, according to the RESTful API conventions, you use a post, right? And you pass the new data as a body, and you map it to the plural noun questions, right? This one's a little more involved because it relates two different nouns, questions and quizzes. And so where quizzes seems to be the context, right? That you are creating a question within the context of a quiz, right? So that has its own set of URLs and whatnot, right? Find all questions. So let's implement just a few. Right? So say this: find all questions. So what we're going to do here is that we want to be able to say, if we want to do const find all questions, and we want to expose that capability, right? Then that would be mapped to, the following. We would map to something like questions, right? Where it's the plural noun of what it is that you are inquiring about, right? And probably we would use a token in front of this, right, to differentiate this from a URL that is mapped to some HTML or CSS or some static data, static file or static content. This is mapped to a dynamic set of data. Okay, so the way you would implement that, right, is that you would use the express library get, right, to map your URL to the implementation of the of the logic, find all questions by ID, find all questions, right? Okay. Now, if you remember, the controller is only responsible for doing the map, right, to some logic. It is actually not responsible for actually retrieving the data or manipulating the data, right? For that, we delegate that to the service, right? So we're going to import it. Oops. We're going to require. We're going to go up to services and down to the question service, right? And so this one can be written in terms of that question service, right? We first retrieve the questions using the question service. Find all questions. Once we have all the questions, we can respond to this. We can send a response back to whoever invoked the URL. Whoever invoked this URL, we can respond by sending back the questions, right? We didn't know how to get it. Instead, we delegate that job to the service, and the service does the most of the work. Now, the thing is that this app, right, this variable here doesn't exist locally in our machine in this file. So somebody needs to pass us a reference to that, right? So for that, we're going to export this as a function that can take as argument the app, right? Takes as argument the app, which is going to be sent to it from the server. So the server, right, is going to pass to the questions controller. Is going to pass a reference to the app, which the questions controller receives and uses it to create these maps of these HTTP requests and this paths, maps it to the implementation of these functions, which in turn delegate the work to the services to actually manipulate the data. Okay, that makes sense. So the other endpoint that we might want to expose is this one, right? Find questions for quiz, right? Where it might look something like this: const find quiz request response, right? Where we pass you presumably the idea of a quiz, and we want the questions for that quiz. Now, the RESTful API web services naming convention stipulates that if you have two entities or nouns that are related to each other, then the API should be the parent. Should start with a plural noun of the parent, followed by the unique identifier of that parent. Which quiz are you talking about? And then finally the plural noun of what actually you want, right? You want the questions. So this reads as in, I want the questions belonging to the quiz whose ID is quiz ID. Okay. And so to implement that, right, we use the get, since we're reading this information, right? We're only retrieving this data for read-only purposes. And then the API would capture the relationship between the two. Okay, so the parent ID followed by the child underneath, right? And then map it to the function. There we go. Okay. All right. So what does this do? So this says, well, I know you're passing me something in the parameters. Let's retrieve that. So this would be const quiz ID. And we can read it from the params quiz ID. Once we have the quiz ID, we have a function in the services, right, that allows us to retrieve what the questions are. Right, called find questions. Question service. Find all questions. Hey, where's where's this one? Did we not implement it? Oh, you know what we didn't do? Probably we did not export it. Yeah, so we implemented it. But we never exported it. Yeah, careful there. Let's export it right here. There we go. So let's go back and there's the function, right? And what are we passing? We're passing the quiz ID. There we go. Pass it in there. Okay, excellent. So that once we have the questions, we can just respond saying, hey, we got it. Got the data. You know, whoever wanted this information back in the client. So yeah, there you have it. So we have both the service that we implemented, this one. Again, the only two that we cared about right now is the questions for a given quiz, really. That's the only one. The controller is exposing two, but really probably we only care about this one where the questions given a set of quizzes. And then the server is loading the questions. Okay, so let's restart the server and let's try it out. Let's see. So we got the quiz. And we can retrieve an individual quiz. 345. That's the quiz, and we just introduced a brand new URL which starts the same, right? /API/quizzes, the ID of the quiz. But then now we can get the questions that belong to that quiz. There you go, right? So this is the API that we just created, right? That iterates over the questions, right? Finding questions that have a specific parent ID, 345. There's also 234 that contains 3 questions, right? So quiz 234 contains 3 questions, right? Which is 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, and 3, 4, 5. Those are the 3 questions. Okay, so I think we have enough, right, to switch over to the client and see if we can build something from this. Okay. All right. So do we have any questions before we switch over to the client? All right. So let's get going. Let's see. So here we're being asked to implement a screen called quizzes. This is a separate screen. It's a completely different screen. So it's not part of the course list. When you click on quizzes, right, it navigates to this brand new screen called quizzes, which lists all the quizzes. Okay. Now, notice that I put the link in all the courses. So that's kind of giving you a hint, telling you that these quizzes belong to that course and no one else, right? But in our design, we don't allow that, right? The quizzes don't know anything about the courses. They know about the questions that belong to the quizzes, but don't know about any parent-child relationship with the courses, right? So even though it's listed here 3-4 times, really it's all the same. They're all the same, right? I mean, we're going to implement it with a forward compatibility that at some point we want quizzes per course. So each course has its own set of quizzes. But right now, all the courses have the same set of quiz. Excuse me. Okay, so let's do that. Let's open up our React application. Let's see, server, blah blah blah. Okay, let's open. Let's say open React. Open recent, blah blah to open. Section 2, and this is our React. We'll say open. Okay. All right, so let's run it. Oh, looks like, okay, I cloned it down from my repository, but I never built it. So we'll do npm install. So what npm install is going to do is that it's going to open up package.json. It's going to look at all our dependencies, right? It's going to look at it and say, ooh, you need a lot of stuff, right? You need Redux, right? You need React Router DOM, right? That you need React Bootstrap, you need Font Awesome, and it's going to download all that. It's going to put it right here in this in a directory called node_modules. All right, so let's do that. npm install. So that's going to take a little bit. Meanwhile, let's take a look at the UI here. So yeah, so we're going to when you click on courses, you're going to navigate to the quizzes, and then the quiz is going to have hyperlinks that should allow you to actually take the quiz, right? To interact with the quiz. You can either click on quiz or the start, and then once you select a particular quiz, it will start rendering the questions in that quiz. All right, it's done. Let's start it now. npm start. And there we go. So there we are. Here's where we left off last time. Right, we have our courses. And what we're going to do is that we're going to add a new link here, okay? That is going to allow us to navigate to the quizzes, right? So for instance, we're going to have let's implement a brand new component, right? In here, let's say source components, and let's do our work under here, quizzes. So in here, we're going to say new JavaScript. We're going to say quizzes list. So this is going to be import React and const quizzes list. It's going to be a function component. And for now, it's just going to display h2 quizzes. Okay. And this is going to export default quizzes. There we go. All right. So what we're going to do is that if we navigate to the following, so let's create a route for this. Let's create the route. It's going to be as follows. If we see the following in the path. We see courses. Now, well, I guess this could be quizzes like that, just quizzes. But thinking a little bit ahead, right? Ideally, you would want the quizzes to belong to a particular course, right? So that instead of just being the quizzes page, you would get the quizzes for course 1, the quizzes for course 2. Different courses have different quizzes. We don't support that, right? The quizzes don't know what course they belong to, so we don't support that. But just just designing, looking ahead a little bit, we can encode the ID of the course as part of the path, so that at some point, we could support it, right? Okay. All right. So if we started, that means that if we go to courses, 1, 2, 3 quizzes, we navigate to quizzes. See there? There we go. See the quizzes right there? Perfect. But we want to navigate there not by us typing it here by hand. Instead, we want to navigate maybe from the courses, just so we can navigate to the course editor. We want to navigate to the quizzes. Okay. So what we'll do is that we're going to go to the table. Here it is, course row. Well, let's add an additional column, maybe a column somewhere right here, right before the buttons. So where are these buttons? So yeah, these are the buttons, right? So right here, let's add an additional column, and this will be a link. And where are we going to go with this link? We're going to go to this URL, right? This URL right here. Oops. Okay. And this is going to be quizzes. There we go. So there's quizzes right there. Right, it's going to navigate. But notice that we're not encoding the ID of the course, right? So instead of having this hard-coded course ID, we have the course ID right here. See that? We have that. So let's add it here. So this would be $, course ID. There we go. Okay, so if we go back and refresh, notice that we have the ID of the course if we ever need it. We don't need it right now, right? But this is kind of looking ahead where we would want quizzes to be different per course. Right now, no matter what course you come from, you're going to get the same exact quiz. All right. I'm sorry, you're going to get the same list of quizzes. The same list of quizzes. All right. So let's focus now on the. Let's focus now on the list of quizzes. What does it want to do? It wants to do what in here? We want to list the quizzes, right? We want to go and say, okay, these are all the quizzes. These are all the quizzes, 3 quizzes. Okay. There you go. So let's do that. So basically, I want to hit this URL. I want to hit that URL. How do I do that? Well, first we need a place to put the quizzes when we get them, right? So probably we wanted to store it in a local state variable, right? And the state variable might be this, something like const quizzes, comma, set quizzes, right? And this is going to be use state, and there's going to be an empty array at first. And when are we going to fetch them? We want to fetch them on load, right? When the component first mounts. So for that, we're going to use effect, right? That use effect, right? It's a function that is going. We want to fetch right here from this URL. Right, we want to fetch those URL from that URL. This is going to come back with a response, which we're going to parse. I'm going to return the body. And then this should be the actual quizzes, which we can use to set the quizzes. Okay. Now, obviously, this is not how you would do it. Right, all this should be moved to. This should be moved to move this to a service file. Okay, this should not live here. There should be a separate service file that does this. Okay, this is bad practice to do this right here in the code. again, because we want to do separation of concern, right? The concern of this JavaScript file is to render data, not fetch data or retrieve data or interact with the data. Instead, a service file would be responsible for the retrieval and manipulation of the data, right, from the client's point of view, right? So yeah, so make sure to move this into a separate service file. But nevertheless, this will fetch the quizzes and store them here. We can list here how many do we have? How many quizzes we have? Let's see. There it is. So it looks like it's working, right? It went out to the server and it came back with 3 quizzes. So we should be able to iterate over them, right? We should be able to say, here's a UL that is going to iterate over this. So it's going to say quizzes dot map that is going to return each quiz, and we want to display maybe a line item that contains the title, right, of the quiz. There we go. So those are the three quizzes, right, that come from this API right here, right? Quiz 1, 2, and 3. Right? We render it, and then what we want to be able to do is that when you click on a quiz, or maybe click on a start, right, according to the assignments, right? If you have the list of quizzes, if you click on start, right, you would navigate to that specific quiz that would contain a list of questions. Okay. So basically, this would be some kind of array, some kind of line item, some kind of link, right? So maybe kind of like a link here that would navigate where? Where would it navigate? Where would this go? Well, wait a minute. Let me close this. We would navigate to basically it would be something like quizzes, and then depending on which quiz you clicked on, maybe if you clicked on this one or whatever. Oops, go back. If you clicked on a particular quiz, we would encode here the ID of the quiz, right? Whatever, 1, 2, 3, or 2, 3, 4, or whatever it is that's in the database. And then here we would render the actual quiz, the quiz being a collection of questions. Okay, so first of all, let's create a component that we can navigate to, right? Let's create the component that we would navigate to. We'll call the quiz component. Okay, so this would be the quiz component, and this is so const the quiz component. Okay, that we would navigate to. Okay, so for now, we're going to return div h3. This is the quiz, and then we go to export default quiz. Okay. All right, so now we can say, okay, how do we navigate there? Well, the URL we are thinking about is the URL where you would have the ID of the quiz you want to render as part of the URL, right? So let's do that. Let's navigate there, right? It's the courses, the ID of the current course, quizzes, and then the ID of the current quiz. So where do we get this? So this is, we've navigated here into the quiz list. And so this, how do we navigate here into the quizzes list? We navigated from like that, the quiz list. We have the course embedded in the second element of the path, and it's mapped to course ID. So we should be able to get it from params. We can use params to retrieve the course ID And what else? And that's it, right? From the params, use params. There we go. So now that we have this variable from the path, right? We can replace this and make it a course ID. And what's this? This is the ID of the current quiz as I am iterating over it, right? So this would be quiz dot underscore ID. Okay, so let's see what that looks like now. If we refresh, we click on this, notice that we do have the ID URL encoded there. So we click on it. Notice that we don't have the route yet, right? We don't have a route to it. So let's route it. We did create the quiz, but we didn't route it. So what we're going to do is that we're going to route. Right? It's going to look exactly the same, followed by, right, the quiz ID. Right, and this is going to render the actual quiz. Right, so if we click on our quiz now, notice that there you go, right? Navigates to quiz. And just to check that this is actually working, let's display the ID of the quiz that we're navigating to, right? Quiz number 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, which is part of the URL, right? So we should be able to parse it using the params. So let's bring in the params. From React router DOM. So we should be able to read that, right? The quiz ID, which we encoded as quiz ID. There we go. Oops. Quiz ID from the use params. There we go. So we should be able to just display here the quiz ID. There we go, 3, 4, 5. See that? Or if we go back, we can, there's 1, 2, 3, or 2, 3, 4, right? Or 3, 4, 5. Perfect. Okay, so we have that. But now that we have that, now that we have the actual quiz, we know we have an API that if we provide the ID and then ask for the questions, we can actually get the questions, right? By retrieving these right there. See that? Using this URL. Why would we do this? When the quiz loads. The quiz loads, we want to invoke this URL. How do we do that? All right, so right here, we want to, once we know the quiz ID, we want to hit that URL. So we know how to do that, right? We have the use effect and we have the use state. That the use state is going to allow us to store. What is this going to come back with? The quiz is going to come back with the questions. It needs to load the questions, right? So let's go get the questions, right? And then set questions. That initially is empty array. And then we load that. We load those questions on, when we first load, right? That's why we use the use effect, right? The use effect allows us to be notified when this component loads, and we want to go fetch. We want to go fetch this URL right here, right? We want to fetch that URL because we know what the ID is, right? We just parsed it, the quiz ID. We know what the quiz ID is, right? And so that's going to get a response, .json, and this is a to-do. Move this to a service file. Once we have the response, we then presumably have the questions right here. Questions. which we can use to set the questions. Okay.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yes, please.
If use params doesn't find the parameter name that you're asking for, does it return an empty string or does it return an error? So like
yeah, it's undefined.
Okay.
We return undefined. Yeah, it would return undefined until it actually finds it. Yep. So you have to be careful, right?
Thank you. And it gets it from the parent component who's running it.
No, it gets it from the path. It parses it from the path, which is configured in the.
But what I mean is that the name quiz ID is getting it from this path.
From yeah, it's configured right here, the route.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So once the quiz retrieves and has the questions, we can specify. We can say, let's print out. Let's see how many questions there are. There are going to be questions.length. Right. So 3, 4, 5 has 2 questions. Quiz 1 has 1 question, and quiz 3 has 2, and quiz 2 has 3 questions. Okay. So we should be able to just iterate over them, right? Like the questions, right? We should be able to say, here's a UL and iterate over them. Questions dot map. And this is the question. And we're going to return the line item, where each line item, we can look at the JSON of each question. Okay, there it is. So these are the JSON for each question. We have the title. We have the actual question. All right, we have the type. Okay, so we could render the title as H4 maybe. So question dot title, then in curly brackets, of course. Right, there it is. So JPA true false, blah, blah, blah. We can render the actual question. Question. JPA stands for Java Persistent API. What does JPA stand for? That's the actual question. We can look at the actual answer. And the correct answer. Right, what does JPA stand for? JPA, Java Persistent API. JPA stands for Java Persistent API, true. And JSON stands for Java Object Notation, false. Okay. So we could do the whole thing here. We could do this whole thing here. Probably a better approach would be to have a dedicated questions, right? Having a dedicated questions a component that can deal with this, right? So question. So here, import React and const question and return export full question. So this we could maybe move it in here, or maybe put a div, an outer div, and then put the question here, and then we can pass the question as an argument, right? And then here we can have the question, and then pass the question as an argument, right? And it would still render the same way, but at least you have a kind of like a higher order component, right? That in here you could be more specific. You can do much more logic about how is it that you want to render this, right? So in particular, what you might want to decide to do is that depending on the type, right? Depending on the type, right? Whether it's true, false, or multiple choice or whatever, you might want to implement each type in a separate component, right? So for instance, you might have a multiple question, multiple choice question, and you might have a true false question. So in the question, you might decide that depending on the type, you might say that if the question dot type, if the question dot type is equal to true false, then you render the, oh, I didn't rename them. So this would be true false question, right? And the multiple choice, this would be multiple choice, right? You would decide to, if it's true false, then render the true false question and pass the question down. Or if it's multiple choice, then you would render the multiple choice question, right? Now notice that it renders exactly the same way, right? It renders exactly the same way, but now, right, you can focus on how each one should render. For instance, the true false question renders completely different from the multiple choice, right? So let's take a look at the homework. For instance, it says that the true false question, which is a little bit easier, renders the question, two radio buttons, your answer, and then a button. Okay, whereas the multiple choice has an array of buttons. So let's look at true false first. Okay, so the true false, let's look at this one. So the true false renders how? We don't have the title, no title, just a question. And then we have a radio button. So input type radio, and with a true, and then false, something like that. Let's see how that renders. Yeah, true false, there we are, right? True false. So notice that it'd be great if I could click on the label and I can select it, as opposed to having to, it's very hard to click this, right? So I can make the label clickable by wrapping all this inside of a label. That. Right, same thing with this one. We can say label that. Now, if I click on the label, now it clicks also the radio button. So notice that these also are clickable, right? But notice that none of these are mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. Let's erase this for a second. There's too much here. So we want these to be mutually exclusive. So how can we do that? So radio buttons are mutually exclusive if they have the same name, right? So for instance, if we say name equal and the values are the same, okay, notice that now if I click this, notice that they're mutually exclusive because they have the same name. They know they're part of the same group. But notice that I'm using the same name for everybody. So if I click on these down here, notice that they're mutually exclusive with the one above, which is not what we want, right? We want it to be mutually exclusive between each other, but not across questions, right? So we need to choose something that is unique within that question. So one easy choice is just to make this equal to the question.id. We know that that's unique within that question. Okay, so now these are mutual. Oops, that didn't work. Oh, it's underscore ID, sorry. Like that. So now if I come here, notice that if I click on these, they're mutually exclusive, but they're not mutually exclusive across question, right? Each question is independently mutually exclusive within those radio buttons, right? Let's see. So the multiple choice is it's almost the same thing, right? They're also radio buttons. They are also radio buttons, but instead of being one radio button, multiple choice question, notice that it has an array of choices. See that? Which is an array of multiple choices there, right? So which is basically a list of many radio buttons, right? So basically, instead of one, we can iterate and render a whole render those radio buttons, right? So let's do that. Let's say we want to iterate, right? Maybe make a UL maybe, right? And then we iterate over the question.choices and then map those. And then that would give me each choice. And I would return the line items for each choice as a radio button, right? As a radio button, and the text would be the actual choice, right? There we go. See that? Now we have each one of these being in the mutually exclusive from the other, right? And mutually exclusive from the true false. See that? And then we want a button, right? That when we click on it, it's going to grade, so that if I haven't answered anything, then nothing is highlighted. If I select something, if I select a particular choice, and I click on grade, then it's going to compare my choice compared to the correct answer. So I'm going to compare my answer with the correct answer. If they are the same, then it's going to put a little checkbox next to my answer and then a big checkbox next to the question, right? Meaning I got it right. If instead I chose the wrong answer, or it's not equal to the correct answer, then it's going to highlight my answer as wrong and will show me what the correct answer is and put an X next to the question. Okay. So to do that, we need to keep track of my answer, right? Or your answer here. So let's create a state variable where we can keep track of that, right? So use state. And so this would be, your answer, and set your answer. Use state, and your answer might at first would be empty. When we click on the radio button, on click, we're going to say that we're going to set your answer to be the actual choice. See that? Right, and then down below here, what we could do is list our answer. I would say, your answer would be your answer, right? Something like that, right? Where if I click on it, notice that it shows my answer here. See that? Which I can compare against the correct answer, right? And down below, if I want to cheat, I can see the correct answer here, right here. See that? And so we could decide to show the we could decide to show whether my answer is the same as the correct answer, right? Like for instance, we might say, let's see, we can decide whether your answer is correct by comparing the correct answer with your answer, right? So correct answer is equal to your answer. Yes, right? Then maybe I'll show a little checkbox or something. So if it is, then maybe show a little class FAS, FA checkbox if they're same, right? So there it is. See the checkbox? So it only shows when you select the correct answer. Okay. Otherwise, if it's not, right, if it's not equal, then maybe you show a times, which is an X, right? So wrong, yes, wrong, wrong. And we can put this whole logic, instead of here, we can put it in the header here, right? Next to the question. Oops. Oh no. What'd I do? Copy. And maybe we can paste it here. Yeah, so the X, might show when you get the wrong answer, but then the checkbox would show when you get the right answer. Plus you can highlight, make this red, green, whatever, blah, 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 right? If it's a right answer or not, right? And you can do, you can highlight the LI. You can highlight it with, let's see, with class name, list group item. And this is class name list group. So it look a little prettier. But then I think you can highlight them. There's a style with color. List group item. And there's a danger for red, I think. Yeah, see that? Or there is a success, green. And so you can make this an expression. Oops, wait a minute. Be an expression so that here this could be calculated. You could say if your answer is equal to the question dot answer correct, right? If it's correct, then this evaluates to success. Otherwise, it evaluates to danger. Oops. There we go. So notice that it's changing depending on whether you got it right or wrong. Okay, but I'll leave it up to you on how to style it. I've shown you, I think, enough examples that you can go in and play around with this styling and finish it off. Okay. All right. Any questions?
Once once you click the grade button, the question should become locked, right? There's no way to change the.
No. Yeah, you don't have to do that. This is just when you grade, then it should display green, red, checkbox, X. I mean, if you want to go beyond that, sure. But no, nothing fancy.
Thanks.
So eventually this is going to be done on the server side. We need to save your answers. So we're going to post all your answers to the server. The server is going to have a copy of all your answers and is going to grade it. It's going to grade all your quizzes and is going to give you a score. But that's later when we have access to a database and we can post your answers to the database, blah, blah, blah. And we can keep track of a history of all the quizzes that you've taken. Okay. That's the next assignment. Anything else? All right, folks. All right, good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Professor.